The holographic star map flickered once, twice, then stabilized into a three-dimensional nightmare of red threat indicators and dying solar systems. Commander Veth Solarin watched the hollow fleet's projected advance crawl across the display like a disease spreading through healthy tissue. And he thought, not for the first time, that whoever had designed this presentation software had possessed a genuine gift for making despair feel personal. 47 inhabited worlds in the projected path, he said, his voice carrying across the obsidian conference table where 20 alien delegates sat in various postures of attention, discomfort, and what he had learned to recognize as polite diplomatic boredom. 12 billion sentient beings. The Hollow Fleet does not negotiate, it does not colonize, it consumes and it moves on. He touched a control surface embedded in his palm, and the display shifted to show fleet compositions, defensive capabilities, resource allocations. Numbers that told a story of inadequacy. Numbers that explained why he was standing in this chamber aboard the diplomatic cruiser Ascendant, attempting to convince species who had been killing each other for millennia that cooperation was their only path to survival. The coalition proposal before you represents humanity's commitment to unified defense, Veth continued. Shared intelligence networks, coordinated fleet movements, a joint command structure that respects the sovereignty of each member species while enabling. Commander Solarin. The voice cut through his presentation like a blade through silk, and the chamber fell into the particular silence that occurs when something terrible is about to happen, and everyone present knows it except the person it will happen to. Ambassador Lysiel of the V3 Dominion rose from her seat at the far end of the table, and Veth felt his carefully prepared words dissolve somewhere between his brain and his mouth. He had read her file, of course. He had studied holographic recordings of her previous diplomatic engagements. He had thought himself prepared. He had been spectacularly wrong. She moved like gravity was a suggestion she had chosen to mostly accept, her twilight blue skin catching the holographic starlight in ways that seemed to bend the colors toward her rather than reflect them naturally. Her hair fell past her shoulders in waves of platinum blonde that reminded him of captured nebulae, and her ears rose to elegant points that swept back along her skull, marking her as clearly non-human despite her otherwise familiar features. The V3 were old when humanity was still debating whether fire was a good idea, and looking at Ambassador Lysiel, Veth could believe every year of that ancient history. She was, he realized with the detached clarity that sometimes accompanies disaster, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She was also, based on the expression settling across her elegant features, about to destroy him. Your proposal, she said, and each word carried the weight of centuries, is an insult. Lieutenant Tamaz Reyes, seated 3 chairs behind Veth in the delegation's secondary row, made a sound that might have been a cough and was almost certainly a suppressed curse. Ambassador, Veth began, but Lysiel raised one hand, and he found himself silent without quite understanding why. You speak of unified defense as though you invented the concept. Your species has been traveling between stars for 2 centuries. 2 centuries, Commander. The V3 Dominion has maintained defensive alliances across this sector for 11,000 years. We were coordinating fleet movements when your ancestors were still arguing about which rocks made the best tools. Someone at the table, Veth thought it might be the Crethani delegate, whose species communicated partially through bioluminescence, flickered in what was probably amusement. Your proposal, Lysiel continued, stepping around the edge of the table with the unhurried grace of someone who knew every eye in the room would follow her regardless of pace, places humanity at the center of the command structure. You suggest this with the confidence of a species that has never lost a war because you have never fought one that mattered. The Hollow Fleet destroyed the Vethani hegemony, 600 inhabited worlds, gone. And you believe you should lead the defense because you have enthusiasm. Veth's diplomatic training screamed at him to respond, to defend, to redirect. His military instincts demanded he stand his ground. But something else, some quiet voice beneath both impulses told him to listen, to watch, to see what she was actually doing rather than what she appeared to be doing. The resource allocation you propose favors human manufacturing capabilities, Lysiel said, her voice never rising, never needing to. Your intelligence sharing protocols contain 17 different clauses that protect human proprietary technology, while demanding full transparency from your proposed allies. Your joint command structure somehow manages to place a human officer in every critical decision-making position. She stopped walking. She was standing perhaps 3 meters from Veth now, close enough that he could see the faint luminescence that pulsed beneath her skin, a V3 trait he had read about but never witnessed. It reminded him of deep ocean creatures, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Tell me, Commander, did you write this proposal believing we would not read it? Or did you write it believing we would read it and simply accept human superiority as natural? Tamaz made another strangled sound. The other delegates had stopped pretending to be anything other than fascinated by the spectacle. The Crethani was flickering so intensely that Veth suspected it was the equivalent of uncontrollable laughter. Ambassador Lysiel, Veth said, and he was grateful that his voice emerged steady. The proposal is a starting point for negotiation. Every element is open for discussion. A starting point, she repeated, and something in her tone made the words feel like a physical impact. You begin negotiations by asking for everything and offering nothing, and you call this diplomacy. This is why your species frightens us, Commander. Not because you are powerful, you are not yet, but because you are young enough to believe that your way of seeing the universe is the only way. The Hollow Fleet thinks the same. They simply have better weapons. The comparison landed like a slap across his face. Veth felt heat rise in his cheeks and fought it down with every ounce of discipline his training had provided. The V3 Dominion, Lysiel concluded, returning to her seat with the same fluid grace that had marked her approach, will review any serious proposal the human delegation cares to submit. This document is not serious. This meeting is adjourned. She sat. She did not look at him again. The other delegates began to stir, conversations resuming in a dozen languages and 3 forms of bioluminescent communication. Veth stood frozen at the head of the table, the holographic star map still displaying its cascade of red threat indicators, the weight of 20 species judgment pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Tamaz appeared at his elbow, gripping his arm with fingers that telegraphed barely contained fury. I'm going to say something I'll regret if we don't leave right now. Then we leave, Veth said quietly. They walked out of the council chamber in silence, and Veth did not allow himself to look back. He could feel Lysiel's attention on him nonetheless, like standing in filtered sunlight, warm where it touched and cold everywhere else. The corridor outside was empty, most of the delegates still filtering out through other exits. Tamaz waited until they had turned 2 corners before exploding. That was, he gestured wildly, searching for words adequate to his outrage. She can't just, the diplomatic protocols alone. She can, Veth said. She did. You're just going to accept that. She compared us to the Hollow Fleet, Veth, the machines that eat planets. She said we think like them. Veth stopped walking. The viewport beside them showed the dying red dwarf star that the Ascendant orbited, a sun in its final centuries, bleeding heat into the void. It seemed appropriate somehow. What would you have me do, Tamaz? Challenge her to a duel? Storm out in righteous anger? We need the V3. Without them, the Alliance falls apart, and without the Alliance, the Hollow Fleet reaches Earth in 30 years. So we just accept humiliation as the price of survival. Veth thought about the question for longer than Tamaz probably expected. He thought about Lysiel's words, cutting as they were, and found himself wondering how many of them had been true. He had written that proposal. He had placed humanity at the center because that was where he instinctively believed his species belonged. Maybe that was the problem. For now, he said finally, We accept that we have much to learn, and we figure out how to write a proposal that doesn't make us look like arrogant children. The synthetic whiskey burned exactly the way it was supposed to, which meant the Ascendant's replication systems were finally working correctly after 3 months of producing alcohol that tasted like someone had filtered engine coolant through old socks. Veth took another sip and stared at the ceiling of his quarters, counting the microfractures in the composite plating that no one had bothered to repair since the ship's last engagement with Crethani pirates 6 years ago. "You're doing that thing again," Tamaz said from the chair he had claimed 2 hours ago and showed no signs of abandoning. "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend you're analyzing a tactical problem, when really you're just replaying every moment of your humiliation in high definition." Veth lowered his gaze from the ceiling to glare at his friend. Tamaz had removed his uniform jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and was currently engaged in the delicate operation of balancing a stylus on the tip of his index finger. The stylus fell, he caught it, he started again. Veth had learned over 15 years of friendship how Tamaz processed stress. "I'm not replaying anything," Veth lied. "You've said arrogant children under your breath 4 times in the last hour. I counted." The stylus fell again. Tamaz caught it again. Veth took another drink. "Her ears were very pointy," Tamaz offered after a moment. "I mean, I know all V3 have the ears, but hers seemed especially pointy. Aggressively pointy. Like they were specifically designed to judge you." "That's not how ears work." "I'm just saying, if I had ears that pointy, I'd probably be critical of everyone too. All that extra surface area picking up sounds of human inadequacy." Despite himself, Veth felt something that might have been the distant cousin of a smile tug at his mouth. "You're an idiot. I'm a supportive idiot. There's a difference." The stylus clattered to the floor. Tamaz left it there. "Look, she ambushed you. Nobody walks into a council meeting expecting to get diplomatically eviscerated by someone who looks like she stepped out of an ancient myth about dangerous, beautiful things that lure sailors to their doom. I don't think that's the comparison you want to make. The point stands. You were unprepared for the sheer force of her being unpleasant at you. It happens. Tomorrow you dust yourself off, write a better proposal, and we pretend today never happened." Veth was formulating a response, something about how pretending wasn't a viable long-term strategy when dealing with species who had been practicing diplomacy since before humans had discovered agriculture, when his personal console chimed. The sound was wrong. He sat up, the whiskey forgotten. Standard communications produced a soft double tone, cheerful and unobtrusive. Priority messages from Earth Fleet Command triggered a sharp triple note that demanded immediate attention. This was neither. This was a single sustained tone, low and resonant, that seemed to vibrate in his chest rather than his ears. "What is that?" Tamaz asked, suddenly alert. Veth crossed to the console and examined the incoming message. The encryption signature made him blink twice to make sure he was reading correctly. V3 diplomatic cipher. Private channel. No subject line. The message contained only coordinates, a location aboard the Ascendant, deep in the diplomatic wing where the non-human delegations maintained their quarters, and a timestamp. 40 minutes from now. "That's her," Tamaz said, reading over his shoulder. "That's the ambassador's encryption. Why is she messaging you privately? She spent an hour telling 20 species that you were an incompetent representative of a presumptuous civilization." "I don't know. It's a trap. It has to be a trap. Some kind of elaborate V3 scheme to further humiliate you in a more intimate setting." Veth stared at the coordinates, remembering Lysiel's face in the council chamber. The cold precision of her words. The way she hadn't looked at him when she sat down, as if he had ceased to exist the moment she finished speaking. But also, the faint luminescence beneath her skin. The way her voice had carried without ever rising. The strange, almost musical quality of her contempt, as if she had practiced it until it achieved a kind of terrible perfection. "I'm going," he said. Tamaz made a sound of pure exasperation. Of course you are. Why would you exercise basic self-preservation when you could walk directly into whatever nightmare scenario the pointy-eared woman of your recent humiliation has planned? If she wanted to cause more damage, she could do it publicly. Whatever this is, she wants it private. That means something. It means she's going to murder you and hide the body in the recycling systems. Then at least I'll be useful to the ship's ecosystem. Veth pulled on his uniform jacket, checking his reflection briefly in the darkened viewport. He looked tired. He felt tired. But curiosity had always been his weakness, and Ambassador Lysiel had become a puzzle he couldn't stop turning over in his mind. The walk to the diplomatic wing took 20 minutes through corridors that grew progressively more alien as he traveled. The Ascendant had been designed to accommodate multiple species, which meant certain sections were kept at different temperatures, different atmospheric pressures, different gravity levels. The V3 preferred their environment cool and slightly humid, and Veth felt goosebumps rise on his arms as he entered their designated area. The door to Lysiel's quarters was unmarked, distinguished only by the faint shimmer of a privacy field that would vaporize anyone who tried to enter without authorization. Veth stood before it, suddenly uncertain, and raised his hand to signal his presence. The field dissolved before he could touch it. He stepped through into darkness. No, not darkness. Dim luminescence, soft and shifting, emanating from what appeared to be flowers. Dozens of them, clustered in arrangements that followed no pattern he recognized, their petals pulsing with gentle violet light that made the shadows dance. The air smelled of something he couldn't name, sweet and ancient and faintly electric, like standing near a lightning strike moments after the thunder fades. Ambassador Lysiel stood at the far end of the chamber, silhouetted against a massive viewport that displayed the dying red dwarf star in all its terminal glory. She did not turn at his entrance. She did not acknowledge his presence at all. Veth waited. The flowers pulsed. The star bled light into the void. "Close the door," she said finally, and her voice was nothing like it had been in the council chamber. Quiet, almost soft, tired in a way that made her sound, for the first time, almost human. Veth touched the control panel. The door sealed behind him. The privacy field reactivated with a soft hum. "You came," Lysiel said, still facing the viewport. Her reflection was ghostly against the glass, her features rendered in shades of red by the dying star's light. "I was not certain you would. You didn't give me much choice. Cryptic messages in the middle of the night tend to demand attention. I gave you every choice, Commander. You could have ignored the summons. You could have reported it to your security staff. You could have assumed it was some elaborate trap and remained safely in your quarters with your synthetic whiskey and your wounded pride." Veth felt a flash of irritation. "If you're going to insult me again, I'd prefer you at least look at me while you do it." She turned. In the pulsing violet light of the bioluminescent flowers, her blue skin seemed to shift and change, patterns emerging and fading like thoughts moving beneath water. Her pointed ears caught the glow, almost translucent at their tips, and her eyes, he hadn't noticed their color before, had been too focused on her words, were silver, bright as polished metal, and filled with something he hadn't expected. "Fear, Commander Solaren," Ambassador Lysiel said. "Someone in your delegation is going to try to kill me before the treaty can be signed. I need your help to find them before dawn. And I need you to understand that everything I said in that council chamber was a lie designed to make your would-be assassin believe I am hostile, vulnerable, and unprepared." Veth stood very still, the way he had learned to stand when a situation shifted so fundamentally that any movement might shatter his ability to comprehend what was happening. The bioluminescent flowers pulsed around him, indifferent to revelations, and Ambassador Lysiel watched him with those silver eyes that seemed to catch every fragment of light in the room and hold it hostage. "An assassin," he said finally, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "In my delegation." "Yes," And you chose to reveal this by publicly humiliating me in front of 20 species rather than, say, sending a private message. Like this one. Lysiel moved away from the viewport, crossing to a console that rose from the floor like something grown rather than built. Her fingers danced across its surface, and holographic displays bloomed into existence around them, filling the chamber with cascading text in scripts Veth couldn't read. "Private messages can be intercepted," she said. "My intelligence operatives detected the threat 6 hours before the council meeting. They could not identify the specific agent, only confirm that someone with access to your delegation's secure channels had been communicating with Hollow Fleet assets." "The Hollow Fleet doesn't have assets. They're machines. They don't negotiate, they don't spy, they just consume. That is what they want organic civilizations to believe." Lysiel pulled one display closer, expanding it until Veth could see the contents clearly. Communication logs, timestamps, encryption signatures. "The Hollow Fleet has been seeding agents among us for centuries. Organic beings who have been convinced, coerced, or modified to serve their purposes. They create chaos. They prevent alliances. They ensure that when the fleet arrives, its targets are isolated and unprepared." Veth stepped closer to the display, his mind racing through implications. If you knew there was an assassin, why not simply cancel the council meeting? Increase security. Because the assassin would simply wait. Try again when I was less prepared. The only way to draw them out is to make them believe they have an advantage. Lysiel turned to face him, and in the holographic light her expression was unreadable. "I needed them to think I had made an enemy of humanity's delegation, that I was arrogant, dismissive, certain of my own superiority. The kind of target who would lower her guard because she believed she had nothing to fear from species she considered beneath her." So the insults were calculated. Every word. Veth thought about the council chamber, the surgical precision of her attacks, the way she had dismantled his proposal point by point, leaving no room for defense or rebuttal. He had admired the technique even as it destroyed him. "You're very good at being unpleasant," he said. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment." Something flickered across Lysiel's face, surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of amusement. "My instructors at the V3 Diplomatic Academy would be gratified to hear it. They spent considerable effort teaching me to weaponize courtesy." Is that what that was? Weaponized courtesy. That was weaponized discourtesy. The principle is the same, only inverted. A console across the room chimed softly, and Lysiel crossed to examine it. Veth watched her move, noting again the fluid grace that seemed to characterize everything she did. It occurred to him that he should be angry. She had used him, manipulated him, turned him into an unwitting participant in her intelligence operation without his knowledge or consent. But he found that the anger wouldn't come. There was an assassin aboard the Ascendant, someone from his own delegation, someone he might know personally, and Lysiel had chosen to trust him with that information rather than simply having him arrested as a potential conspirator. "Why me?" he asked. "You could have contacted my security chief, my intelligence officer, anyone with actual authority to investigate threats." Lysiel did not look up from her console, because any of them could be the assassin. "You are the only member of your delegation, I am reasonably certain, is not compromised." Reasonably certain, not completely certain. Complete certainty is a luxury intelligence work does not provide. She finally turned, and there was something almost like respect in her silver eyes. "But I watched your face in the council chamber, Commander. When I spoke of the Vethani hegemony of the 600 worlds the Hollow Fleet consumed, I saw genuine horror. The assassin would not have felt horror, they would have felt satisfaction." Veth remembered the moment she described. The red threat indicators spreading across the star map like blood through water. The weight of numbers too large to truly comprehend. "So we have until dawn," he said, "to identify a traitor hidden among people I've worked with for years. Using what evidence?" Lysiel gestured, and the holographic displays reorganized themselves into personnel files. Human faces floated in the violet-tinted air, accompanied by service records, psychological evaluations, communication logs. His entire delegation, rendered in data. We have intercepted transmissions, but they were routed through 17 different relay points and encrypted with algorithms that would take months to fully decrypt. We have behavioral analysis suggesting the agent has been in position for at least 2 years. And we have, she paused, something complicated moving behind her expression, my intuition, which my people value highly even when it cannot be quantified. Your intuition. Veth moved to examine the floating personnel files more closely. The V3 make decisions based on intuition. We make decisions based on what you might call emotional resonance. The V3 word is velethari. It translates poorly, but the closest approximation would be the sense of rightness or wrongness that exists beneath conscious thought. Gut feeling. Lysiel's pointed ears twitched in what Veth was beginning to recognize as irritation. If you must reduce 11,000 years of philosophical development to a crude anatomical metaphor, then yes, gut feeling. Veth couldn't help it, he laughed. The sound seemed to startle Lysiel, her silver eyes widening slightly. Perhaps she had expected him to remain wounded and resentful, focused on his humiliation rather than the task at hand. Perhaps she had not expected him to find anything amusing about their situation. I apologize, he said, not entirely meaning it. It's just that I've spent the last several hours convinced that your people were impossibly ancient and sophisticated, and now I discover that your diplomatic decisions are based on the same gut feelings my grandmother uses to predict weather. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She was also wrong about the weather roughly 40% of the time. Lysiel studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that made her look, briefly, almost bird-like. Then her lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. Perhaps we should examine the evidence before relying on anyone's grandmother, she said. The transmissions indicate the assassin has access to high-level security protocols. That narrows the field considerably. She manipulated the display, and most of the personnel files faded, leaving only a handful floating in the phosphorescent air. Veth recognized each face immediately: his security chief, his communications officer, his intelligence analyst, Tamaz. His stomach contracted involuntarily. Not Tamaz, anyone but Tamaz. Your Lieutenant Reyes has the necessary access, Lysiel said, her voice carefully neutral. His psychological profile indicates strong emotional bonds with you personally, which could be either evidence of loyalty or a carefully constructed cover. Tamaz has been my friend for 15 years. He's not a hollow fleet agent. The Vethani ambassador who betrayed the hegemony had been her people's most trusted diplomat for 3 centuries. She personally negotiated the treaties that were supposed to protect them. When the fleet came, she opened the door. Veth forced himself to breathe slowly, to think rather than react. Lysiel was not accusing Tamaz. She was presenting facts, following evidence, doing exactly what an intelligence operative should do. His emotional response was irrelevant to the truth of the situation. What would you need, he asked carefully, to eliminate him as a suspect? Access to his private communications. Verification of his whereabouts during the times the intercepted transmissions were sent. And ideally, evidence pointing conclusively toward someone else. The flowers pulsed around them. The dying star bled light through the viewport, and somewhere aboard the Ascendant, an assassin was preparing to murder the only person who stood between humanity and isolation in a war they could not win alone. Then we should begin, Veth said. We have a long night ahead of us. The hours passed in a rhythm of data analysis and quiet conversation, the bioluminescent flowers marking time with their slow pulse as Veth and Lysiel eliminated suspects one by one. The dying red dwarf outside the viewport had rotated slightly in its death throes, casting longer shadows across the chamber. And somewhere in the distance, the Ascendant's environmental systems hummed their endless mechanical lullaby. Tamaz had been cleared first, his communication logs revealing nothing more sinister than an embarrassing number of messages to a Crethani cultural attaché, whose bioluminescent flirtation patterns he had apparently been trying to decode for weeks. Veth had felt relief wash through him like warm water, followed immediately by the uncomfortable realization that he would need to have a conversation with his friend about interspecies romantic protocols. Your Lieutenant Reyes appears to be attempting courtship with a species that communicates romantic interest through synchronized light patterns, Lysiel observed, something that might have been amusement flickering in her silver eyes. He has been responding to her signals with what she probably interprets as either profound confusion or an elaborate insult to her family lineage. That sounds exactly like Tamaz. The Crethani word for the pattern he's been accidentally producing translates roughly to, "Your mother's bioluminescence reminds me of diseased algae." Veth buried his face in his hands. "I'm going to have to tell him, aren't I? Unless you wish the Crethani delegation to challenge him to ritual combat, yes." They had moved on, eliminating the security chief through verified location data, the communications officer through a complete absence of the technical knowledge necessary to route transmissions through 17 relay points. The field narrowed, the night deepened, and gradually, inevitably, the evidence began pointing towards someone Veth barely knew. Crewman Yuki Tanaka, junior analyst, assigned to the delegation 6 months ago through a routine transfer request. Quiet, competent, utterly unremarkable in every way that should have made her remarkable. "Her background check shows inconsistencies," Lysiel said, pulling up the relevant files. "A brother who died in childhood, except the death certificate was issued by a hospital that burned down 3 years before the date listed. Academy records that place her in 2 different locations on the same day. Small errors, easily overlooked individually. But together they form a pattern of careful construction. Someone built Yuki Tanaka from spare parts and hoped no one would look too closely." Veth studied the face floating in the holographic display. Young, earnest, forgettable. He had spoken to her perhaps 3 times in 6 months, brief exchanges about data analysis and filing protocols. She had seemed nervous around him, which he had attributed to the natural anxiety of a junior officer in the presence of command staff. Now he wondered if she had been nervous for entirely different reasons. "We need proof," he said. "Suspicion isn't enough to act on." "No, but suspicion is enough to set a trap." Lysiel outlined her plan with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it for hours, while pretending to focus on other things. She would make herself vulnerable, visible, apparently unguarded. Veth would position security assets in concealment, ready to intervene the moment the assassin revealed themselves. It was simple, elegant, and placed Lysiel directly in the path of someone who wanted her dead. "You're using yourself as bait," Veth said flatly. "I am the only bait the assassin will find credible. There has to be another way. We could confront Tanaka directly, force a confession, use the evidence we've gathered. The evidence we've gathered is circumstantial. A good lawyer could explain away every inconsistency. And if we confront her and fail to prove her guilt, she will simply wait, disappear into another identity, try again when I am less prepared." Lysiel's silver eyes met his, and there was something fierce beneath their calm surface. "I have been hunted before, Commander. I prefer to control the terms of the encounter." They argued. Veth deployed every tactical objection he could construct, and Lysiel dismantled each one with the same surgical precision she had used on his treaty proposal. The difference was that this time he could see she took no pleasure in it. This time she was fighting to convince him because she needed his cooperation, not because she wished to demonstrate superiority. In the end, he agreed. Not because she had persuaded him the plan was safe. It wasn't. but because he could not think of a better alternative, and dawn was approaching with the inexorable certainty of stellar mechanics. They set the trap. Lysiel positioned herself in the observation lounge adjacent to the council chamber, apparently alone, apparently reviewing documents in preparation for the treaty signing. Veth concealed himself and 3 security officers in the maintenance corridor that ran behind the lounge's decorative panels, close enough to intervene within seconds. The wait was the worst part. Time stretched like taffy in a gravity well, each minute lasting approximately forever. Through a gap in the paneling, Veth watched Lysiel's back, the gentle curve of her pointed ears, the way her platinum hair caught the light from the viewport. She looked peaceful. She looked like someone who had no idea death was stalking toward her. She was, he realized, an extraordinary actress. The door to the observation lounge opened. Yuki Tanaka entered with the quiet efficiency that had characterized everything Veth had ever seen her do. She carried a data tablet, nothing unusual for an analyst, but her eyes swept the room in a pattern that spoke of tactical assessment rather than casual observation. "Ambassador Lysiel," she said, and her voice was different now, harder, older. "I apologize for the interruption. Commander Solarin asked me to deliver these updated projections." Lysiel did not turn. "Leave them on the table." Tanaka moved closer. Her hand shifted on the tablet, and Veth saw something glint beneath her fingers. A weapon disguised as a stylus, probably, something that could pass through standard security screening. He burst through the panel. The next few seconds collapsed into chaos and muscle memory. Tanaka spun toward him with speed that no human should possess, her weapon coming up in a blur of motion. Veth caught her arm, twisted, felt something in her wrist give way with a sound that was entirely wrong, mechanical rather than organic. She didn't scream. She didn't react to pain at all. The security officers swarmed from their positions. Tanaka fought with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew they were caught, but refused to surrender. It took all 4 of them to bring her down, and even then she continued struggling until Veth found the neural disruptor at his belt and pressed it against her temple. She went limp. In the sudden silence that followed, Veth became aware of several things simultaneously. His heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. His uniform jacket had torn along one seam. And Lysiel was standing exactly where she had been throughout the encounter, watching with an expression he couldn't interpret. "Her wrist," Lysiel said quietly. "You felt it. It wasn't human. The bones, the joints, something was wrong." Hollow fleet conversion. They take organic beings and replace pieces of them with machinery. Sometimes the subjects are willing. Sometimes they are not. Lysiel crossed to where Tanaka lay unconscious, studying her with silver eyes that held something like pity. She may not even remember who she was before they changed her. Veth looked down at the woman he had thought was a junior analyst. Somewhere beneath the modifications and the programming, was there still a person? Someone who had been taken, transformed, turned into a weapon against her will. He supposed it didn't matter. She had tried to murder an ambassador. She had nearly succeeded. "We should get her to the brig," he said, "and sweep the ship for any other compromised personnel." "Yes." Lysiel hesitated, then reached out and touched his arm briefly. Her fingers were cool against his skin, and the contact lasted only a moment before she withdrew. "Thank you, Commander. You could have chosen not to believe me tonight. Many would not have." "You were right about the proposal," Veth said. "It was arrogant, presumptuous, all the things you said. I was also cruel. That was not necessary. That was," she paused, searching for words, "me being too good at my job." The security officers lifted Tanaka's unconscious form and carried her toward the door. Dawn was coming, the ship's lighting systems beginning their slow transition from night cycle to day. In a few hours, the council would reconvene. The treaty would be signed. The alliance against the Hollow Fleet would become reality. But first, Veth realized, he needed to deal with the aftermath of a night he suspected would stay with him for a very long time. Lysiel returned to her quarters to prepare for the ceremony. Veth walked back through corridors that felt different now, charged with the residue of danger survived. He found himself thinking about her fingers on his arm, cool and brief. About the fear he had seen in her eyes when she first revealed the assassination plot. About the way she had stood motionless while death approached, trusting him to save her. He thought about trust, and wounds, and words that meant both things at once. When he reached her quarters an hour later to escort her to the council chamber, he found her asleep at her console, head pillowed on her arms. The holographic displays still showing the communication intercepts they had analyzed together. The bioluminescent flowers pulsed their gentle rhythm around her, and in their light she looked young, exhausted, and impossibly far from the cold ambassador who had dismantled him in public. Veth stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe. Then he removed his uniform jacket, the one with the torn seam, and draped it carefully across her shoulders. She stirred slightly, murmuring something in her own language, but did not wake. He left a message on her console. The ceremony could wait another hour, and walked out into the corridor, closing the door softly behind him. The treaty signing ceremony unfolded with the precise choreography of events that would be recorded in history databases across 12 star systems. Ambassador Lysiel stood at the center of the council chamber, resplendent in formal V3 diplomatic robes that shimmered with threads of captured starlight. Her platinum hair arranged in an elaborate style that made her pointed ears seem like architectural features rather than biological ones. She spoke words of unity and shared purpose, and the holographic recorders captured every syllable for posterity. Veth watched from his position at the head of the human delegation, wearing a fresh uniform jacket that did not have a torn seam, and felt the strange disconnection that comes from knowing the private story behind a public moment. 20 alien delegates applauded. The Krathani flickered with patterns of celebration. The treaty was signed in 17 different scripts, each delegation affirming their commitment to the alliance that would stand against the Hollow Fleet. He and Lysiel did not speak privately. There was no opportunity, and perhaps no need. When their eyes met across the chamber during the formal reception that followed, she inclined her head slightly. Acknowledgement, gratitude, something else he could not name, and then turned to greet the Methani ambassador with the same cool grace she brought to everything. Tamaz appeared at Veth's elbow, holding 2 glasses of something that glowed faintly purple. The Krathani cultural attaché asked me to give you this. Apparently it's a traditional celebration drink. Also apparently, I've been accidentally insulting her family for 3 weeks. So I heard. You could have told me. I was busy preventing an assassination. Your romantic humiliation had to wait. Tamaz handed him one of the glasses, his expression shifting to something more serious. I still can't believe it was Tanaka. I reviewed her transfer paperwork myself. Everything looked perfect. That was the point. Veth sipped the Krathani drink, which tasted like liquid flowers and mild electrical current. The Hollow Fleet has been doing this for centuries. They're very good at creating people who don't exist. She's talking, by the way. Intelligence has been interrogating her since dawn. Apparently the conversion process leaves gaps. She remembers being someone else before, but not who, just fragments, emotions without context. Tamaz shook his head. Almost makes you feel sorry for her. Almost. But Veth remembered the way she had moved in the observation lounge, the inhuman speed, the absolute absence of hesitation. Whatever Yuki Tanaka had been before the Hollow Fleet found her, that person was gone. What remained was a weapon wearing human skin. The reception continued for hours, as diplomatic receptions always did. Veth performed his duties with mechanical precision, making conversation with delegates whose names he would not remember tomorrow, accepting congratulations for a treaty he had nearly destroyed through arrogance. When the V3 delegation finally departed, Lysiel leading them in a procession of twilight blue skin and pointed ears and ancient dignity. He watched them go and felt something in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. She did not look back. The weeks that followed brought the controlled chaos of Alliance implementation. Fleet deployments were coordinated. Intelligence networks were integrated. A joint command structure emerged that looked nothing like the human-centric proposal Veth had originally submitted, because he had rewritten it completely, incorporating Lysiel's criticisms until the document reflected genuine partnership rather than disguised dominance. Military analysts projected that the war against the Hollow Fleet would turn within a decade. For the first time in centuries, organic civilizations had unified against the machine threat. It was, by any objective measure, a triumph. Veth found himself thinking about it during the night cycles, when the Ascendant was quiet and the corridors empty. He would walk to the observation deck and stand before the viewports, watching the stars wheel past in their ancient patterns, and he would remember a chamber filled with bioluminescent flowers and a woman who had trusted him with her life. Tamaz noticed because Tamaz always noticed. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where you stand here, staring at V3 space like you're waiting for something." Veth did not answer. The stars continued their indifferent rotation. "You could message her," Tamaz said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "The diplomatic channels are open now. You could just say hello." "And say what?" "Thank you for publicly humiliating me as part of an elaborate intelligence operation. I enjoyed our night of assassination prevention. We should do it again sometime." "Something like that, yes. The treaty is signed. The alliance is functioning. There's no reason for further personal contact." Tamaz was quiet for a long moment. "Then, you know what the V3 word for trust translates to?" Veth turned to look at his friend. "She told you." "She told the whole council, actually. During the reception, when someone asked about V3 diplomatic philosophy. She said trust and wounds share the same root in her language because her people believe you can only truly trust someone who has the power to hurt you." Tamaz paused. "She was looking at you when she said it." The observation deck felt suddenly smaller, the viewport suddenly larger. Veth turned back to the stars and tried to find words for what he was feeling. He failed. "The V3 ship Eternal Vigilance is scheduled to pass through this sector in 3 days, Tamaz continued. "Ambassador Lysiel is aboard. Routine diplomatic transit, nothing special. I happen to know this because I've been monitoring V3 fleet movements, which is absolutely within my job description, and not at all because I'm a hopeless romantic who wants his best friend to stop moping." "I'm not moping." "You're absolutely moping. You've been moping for 6 weeks. The crew has a betting pool about whether you'll ever stop staring at that viewport." Veth considered being offended. He considered pointing out that commanding officers did not mope, that his behavior was simply thoughtful contemplation appropriate to the weight of recent events. He considered several dignified responses. Instead, he laughed. It felt strange, like using a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. "What are the odds?" he asked. 60-40 against. I've got money on you eventually pulling yourself together, so if you could manage that, I'd appreciate it." The stars wheeled. The Ascendant hummed its mechanical lullaby, and Veth stood at the viewport, watching the distant light of systems he would never visit, thinking about a woman with silver eyes and pointed ears and a voice like captured starlight. 3 days later, the Eternal Vigilance passed through the sector. Long-range sensors detected its transit, a ghost of energy signatures at the edge of scanner range. Veth stood at the observation deck and watched the indicators move across his display, tracking the V3 ship's progress through the void. He did not send a message. She did not send one either. But when he returned to his quarters that night, he found a small package waiting on his desk. No sender identification, no accompanying note. Just a simple container that opened to reveal his uniform jacket, the torn one, which he had left draped across her shoulders, cleaned and pressed and folded with obvious care. Nestled in its folds was a single bioluminescent flower, its petals pulsing with soft violet light. It should not have survived separation from its native soil. It should not have been able to bloom in an environment so far from V3 atmosphere and chemistry. But there it was, glowing gently in the darkness of his quarters, impossible and beautiful and somehow still alive. Veth lifted it carefully, watching the light pulse against his fingers. He thought about trust and wounds and words that meant both things. He thought about a night spent hunting assassins, and a morning spent watching her sleep. He thought about all the things they had not said because there had been no time, no opportunity, no framework for conversations that did not fit into diplomatic protocols. He placed the flower in a small preservation case he had to fabricate specially, calibrating the environmental controls through 6 hours of trial and error, until he found settings that seemed to keep it healthy. It sat on his desk after that, pulsing its gentle rhythm, a fragment of another world that had somehow found its way to him. The crew continued to whisper about the commander who stood alone at the observation deck during night cycles. Tamaz continued to make jokes about pointy ears and emotional unavailability. The war against the Hollow Fleet continued its slow turn toward eventual victory. And Veth continued to watch for V3 ships that never came, holding onto a connection that had never been named but could not be forgotten. Some nights, when the stars aligned correctly,